an illustrated lecture. And as Professor Zhang just said, two of the slides are from last week in Beijing. So without I want to start the lecture, but first I have to remark on a special coincidence which follows on the extraordinary welcome that you all have extended to me. And that means this is your 75th anniversary, but it's my 57th year of working at CUHK. So I went back and, as Professor Zhang said, I came here in '67 as the Wellesley Yenjing Fellow and was in the Sociology and Social Work Department for 2 years. And we lived on campus. The first picture is up on the left hand is the view from where we lived up halfway up the hill. And that was Speak Cantonese Book 1 and Speak Cantonese Book 2, which you see on looking there out over the mountain on which later, of course, the New Asia campus is created. The other picture is with several of my students in Toll Harbor, which of course looks nothing like that now, but still is a place we return to again and again. And then I wanted to honor two of the faculty from that period who made such an impression on me. One was S.L. Wang, who was the chairman of sociology, which was an infant program then, who was a graduate of Lingnan, graduate in Guangzhou, and Rance Li Puilong, who was my supervisor and had just returned from Pittsburgh. So it's a very, very special moment for me to come on your 75th anniversary and my 57th being at CUHK. And all these elaborate words about my scholarship, but what I'd stress was the openness and the welcome I received 57 years ago here on this campus, which changed my life. This really is the place where I became the scholar that I later became, but the person that I came. And it changed me, and I hope that I know that the investments that are being made in students now from many, many people will change your lives also. So now for the academic talk. This is a picture which some of you may have seen from September. This is a gathering of officials in Jiangsu province to launch the new culture of marriage. So today's lecture is going to be a very short overview. The Chinese government has goals. They wish to transform marriage, and the question will be, are they likely to transform marriage? So this gathering, you can see all the officials in the front, and in the back are these 300 couples who have agreed to a group marriage, which will be less costly and which will therefore exclude their parental investment and should be the future of China. So this is the face, the official face of where the government now would like marriage to go. This is the reality of marriage today in China. It's a very fragile institution. And what we have here is a very simple description, the blue representing the number of marriages from 1978 onward, and the last one, 2023. There certainly is a surge in the number of marriages, but it's the ratio between the orange and the blue, the ratio between divorces and marriages. So if we go back here, we often start stories about China today with the opening up and the reform period in 1978, 1980. And it's not that there was no divorce, but it was 23 marriages to each divorce. And as we follow through, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, you can see the ratio shifts to 7 marriages to 1 divorce. 2010, 4.6 marriages to 1 divorce. And there's a certain peak in terms of the total number of marriages. But since in these last 15 years, really a precipitous decline in the number of marriages, of course, the number of divorces, but the ratio, so that in 2023, it was 2 marriages for every divorce. So China is a place in which marriage is extremely fragile. And it's against that background, of course, that the government is interested in strengthening the institution. And what I'll share with you in the next half hour are different ways of thinking about this institution and whether or not this top-down type of invocation for a new style of marriage has any hope of being realized. This is the other piece of a recent declaration. This addresses the fertility issue. So the Chinese population in the last 2 years has shrunk. It is one of the most rapidly aging populations in the world. And the government is very, very concerned, as we know, in increasing the birth rate. And you can't reverse the aging. You can't reverse the things that have happened, but it will allow perhaps to be a greater balance going forward. Here are some pictures that capture the government's past and most recent efforts to support families. So in the early one, the 421 families, this is the one-child policy era. The ideal family would be this one child here with two of her grandparents. Then as the policy was shifted to allow a second birth, the appropriate picture is a family with 2 children, a couple and the elderly parents, the in-laws, one side of the family, in-laws. There are 2 other in-laws who are not in this picture. And then the last is from Changsha this summer, and that's where it is part of the effort to try to say 3 is best. And it's not just a 2-child limit. In fact, there should be a 3rd birth, but also a 3rd limit. So the government remains in control of population size, and they would like to encourage individuals to have a 2nd and 3rd birth, but they're also at the same time wanting to constrain the fertility of the country. So this is still a very much a developmental state that wants to define the demography of families. Here is a table we used in a lecture this semester, which shows this dramatic decline in fertility that is uppermost in many people's minds. So it goes back, this one goes back to 1953, appropriately. Whoops, sorry. Okay. Whoops. Which direction do we want to go? Hey, yo. Yeah. Oh, here I am. I got my pointer mixed up. Okay, so here is the 53, and you can see this is births, this is deaths. The middle section is with the Great Leap Forward, but there's the recovery from the Great Leap Forward, a peak, and then we watch it fall and fall, with the most dramatic change being, oh, sorry, thanks, that's better, great. So what we're interested in, what I want to flag, is this dramatic drop over the 70s. And it's at this point that the one-child policy is announced. And then there's this is a demographic because people who've delayed marriage, people who become of marital age. So the birth rate goes slightly up, but then we can see throughout this entire recent era, it falls. And then here's the turning point. So that now, this is last year, deaths exceed births. So this is where China is now, and the government would like this rate to go up, and this number of deaths will continue. The rate, you'll see, will stay the same. The number will increase. And here is the other way of looking at it, which is, I think, sometimes better. We call it total fertility rate, which is, it's a demographic convention, but it gives you a sense of what would the total number of average births per woman. So as opposed to a rate, which is over the population. So if we start in 1930, and you can see it's over 5, down during the war years, it increases up. Here's a peak at about 6. And since then, since really the Great Leap Forward, you see it falling down, slight up. And this yellow line is the key issue for the government and for any country. If you want your population steady, you have a TFR replacement of 2.1. And since the early 90s, China has been well below replacement. We call this sub-replacement. And this is what is of concern to the government. I just flagged this one so you can see where Hong Kong stands in relationship to China. And this is, we have Taiwan, South Korea, Vietnam, Hong Kong, Japan, and then the OECD. So in 1950s, we have this is 7 births per women in Taiwan, Japan over 3. And now this is projected, but if we look at right now, pretty much all these countries in East Asia are well below replacement. And the question one would ask is, does China have a chance of being different? Will it be different than Hong Kong? Will it be different than Taiwan? Will it be different than South Korea? And the Chinese government now is hopeful that it can be different. That in China, in contrast to the rest of Asia, East Asia, and the rest of Europe, that they would be able to push the birth rate up so that it would be at least replacement. That's the challenge, and it's a severe challenge. Why am I talking in such detail about TFR when you've been told I'm going to talk about the future of marriage? First, let's see, whoops. We have these, oh, I'm sorry. This, we want to get rid of on here. Okay, so this should bring it up, right? No, didn't bring it up. How do I bring up this one will do it? There we go. First, because China, as in other parts of East Asia, very few children are born outside of marriage. So when we make the comparisons with Europe or Latin America, and we're interested in watching when fertility rises and falls, we don't bracket marriage, but we look outside of marriage as well as within marriage. And in the East Asian case, this isn't yet the case. So this is the first reason why you have it. And also until very recently in China, marriage presumed children, so that the first birth usually occurred within 24 months. And without children, a marriage is presumed to be incomplete. But today, as Celine said in the overview of the lecture, what we're seeing is that more young adults and even their parents are now questioning this assumption. So this is where we'll go in the discussion. I need to just step back and do a little bit of academic work here. And I want to look at particularly what the Chinese government did in the past to try to shape the institution and experience of marriage. This is not the first time the Chinese government has done this. So I want to bring you back to 1950 and highlight some of the ways in which the government of the People's Republic of China specifically tried to change family life, and they started by the new marriage law. It was the first piece of legislation passed after 1949. It required monogamy and outlawed concubinage. It prohibited arranged marriage and child betrothal. It created these minimum ages for first marriage of a woman and a man, and it legislated what we might call on-demand divorce. That is, if one party wanted to break up the marriage legally, this could happen. The other thing that's equally important is, of course, what happened with family property. And with collectivization, both land and firms were taken away from the control of the parents. And in the cities, this was something I spent a lot of time working on in the 90s, private housing remained, but most housing was decommodified, and all the new housing that came in online was rental. So this also put the parents on the sidelines. They could no longer control the young adults' jobs or their housing, and nor could they pass on to particularly their sons, assets that would define a man's future. And this is a relationship I've called supplicants to the state. So when we looked at urban families in the 80s and the 90s, they were very much involved and supplicate to state institutions. This is much less the case now, and this is one of the reasons why, even as the government is so ambitious to change things, it has fewer and fewer ways to make their wishes realized. Then the last thing is the role of prostitution, which was extremely common and widely practiced in before 49, and the Chinese government was extremely effective in criminalizing prostitution, not so much the prostitutes, but the brothel owners and the industry. And it wasn't that they eliminated it 100%, but the contrast between, let's say, 1947 and 1954 was extraordinary. So what were the realities of this? Sexual intimacy was largely confined to marriage. Extramarital intimacy was subject to political censure. Of course, there were affairs. Of course, people, played outside the rules. But if you were caught, this would have enormous consequences for your career, for your job. And in this way, there was a very different environment in which sexual intimacy was realized in the 50s, the 60s, and even through the 70s. Child marriage largely disappeared. Definitely parents, especially in rural areas, contracted marriages, made promises of marriage, but relatively few children were transferred from one home to another. Relatively few children were betrothed formally. And that was also extremely important in terms of giving power to the younger generation and away from their parents. This matching of doors, not unique to China. The idea that when parents are involved in their children's marriage, they're looking for a family like their own. They may want a family that perhaps has better economic resources, but they don't want them to have too much better an economic standing, because this will create disparities going forward. It's not that there are no cases or trends of marrying up, but the general strategy is to find a match and to find an appropriate match. But in the Mao era, this became increasingly politicized. So you were marrying, be sure that if it was a Wulei Fenzi household, a 5 bad category household, they tended to only be able to marry within Wulei Fenzi jiating. With the exception, in many daughters did not carry the jiating shenfen. So families who were in difficulty politically could use their daughters as a way to advance their families. They also could exchange daughters and sons. But the environment of matching doors became political in a way that had not been true before. As I said, divorce is possible on demand, but it was extremely rare. And you saw in that first slide the ratio of marriages to divorces in those early years. It was very difficult to get a divorce. And the law said it was easy. The reality, it was very difficult. And for the first time, this is one of the most important things to understand, I think, about how the Chinese Revolution changed people's experience with marriage, and that was it became universal for men as well as women. Whereas in the 1930s, the best estimates we have, about overall for the nation, 15% of men never married. The sex ratio was against them. Wealthy men could take second consorts, and to marry you needed resources. And many, many men did not have those resources. And then you add the wars, and the reality was that at 1949, 1950, you had a situation in which virtually every woman would be married, but not every man. And what we see here over time is how China, becomes this. Up above you see, okay, we look first at, this is women, and we look at this particular age group, because most people will have married by age 35. Okay, so we'll start at 1970, and you can see we're looking at Hong Kong, Japan, Taiwan, Singapore, Chinese in Malaysia, South Korea, and China. So 1970, this is women. It's 5% never married at this age. For China and for South Korea, it's virtually universal marriage. It's very close to universal marriage in Hong Kong. 1980s, we start to see this separation. 1990s, here we are in 2000. So at this point, you have a significant number of women, Hong Kong being the one with the highest level, who have never married at this age. They still may marry, but the likelihood is rather low. China, by contrast, remains down here. Universal marriage, really, until this is through 2005. When we look at men, the point that I was making, what did the revolution do? It made it possible for men to marry. Here we have the Chinese, the gray line. This is at 1970, so I'm not talking about the 15% in 1930, but it's already in 1970, about 5% of men have not married at that age, and we watch it come down. So that this is what is striking, and China looks quite different than these other places. Japan and Hong Kong being the extreme cases of 25% of the population of men at this age never marrying. Okay, fast forward. More history, but fast forward. One-child policy, everyone in this room is quite aware of it. The new marriage law, maybe many of you are not as familiar, but it really did make divorce a lot easier. The way of what one had to prove, and it also created a more supportive environment in which people who had been really estranged for many years were able to realize their estrangement and divorce and remarry if that was their choice. They end also the Jiating Shenfen. So this is, to some people, would seem not very important. For those of us who spent many years collecting family histories, listening to how a politicized family background shaped not only your opportunity to marriage, your opportunity to go to college, your opportunity in some cases to get medical care. And in 1980, one of the things that the Deng administration did early on was end. And one of the things that was so striking to me in that 79 and then in 81, when I went back again, the forms no longer even had that line. So before 1979, there was on everything you filled out was your Jiating Shenfen, and then gone. And that made a big difference. There also, the geographic mobility is huge. We all know 300 million people have left the villages now and are living away from their homes. And the turning point is really 83, when the People's Communes are ended and replaced by the Xiang government. The rationing doesn't end until later, but it's from this point on that we see tens of millions of young people leaving the villages and leaving their parents and moving on to lives where they will be in more control than they were in the earlier era. The marriage law is revised. I'm not going to, we can do it in Q&A, but it is important. This one makes divorce even easier. And then the big turning point is with this marriage law, the Supreme People's Court has interpretations on whom does the marital home belong to. And then the biggest thing in terms of divorce, the State Council has a new what it does is it turns back registration and said, if you want to marry, if you want to divorce, you no longer need a letter of permission from your employer. And if we went back to this table at the beginning, you'll see that 2003 is the point where the divorces surge as never before. I probably in the Q&A rather than in the next comments, I'll talk more about this Supreme Court's interpretation in 2011. What happened starting in 2003, but accelerating after 2011, home ownership, particularly in the cities, becomes more and more concentrated, not concentrated, but seen as the property of an individual. And if it's the husband's parents who bought it, they also have a right to the claim of the conjugal home. And this represents a theme that I'll pursue for the next 10 at the end of the lecture about the role of parents in marriage today. So, unanticipated consequences. By treating marriage as a contract between two willing partners with individual property rights, like any other contract, which will be solved disputes through the civil code. They threw out the long-established practice to protect and prioritize conjugal property claims and favored what social scientists call formal over substantive equality. And this clearly has a spillover then in what is the character of marriage? What are people expecting having entered a marriage? What are the assets that one acquires in marriage jointly shared? Or is there increasingly an attitude, I bring mine, you bring yours, or your parents have given us this piece, and everybody still has the claim to the piece that they brought to the marriage. And so the sense of merging, the sense that it's a conjugal unit, is increasingly undermined, and increasingly it puts marriage at risk. By removing fault from divorce, they've also loosened constraints on divorce by eliminating the need for the employer or the village head to grant you permission to marry or divorce. This has also increased the number of divorces. And then by loosening control over sexuality, but tightening control over childbearing, as in the one-child policy, there is an ongoing sexual revolution. And I saw it emerging in the early years, in the 80s, through the propaganda and the extensive effort for contraception and education. And this was a marked departure from the past. At the same time, there was a control of fertility. And then depoliticizing marital life, reducing supervision, weakened this stigma of the non-marital sexual intimacy. Here I'm going to show you three things that support this. First is about cohabitation. So this is from the surveys that have been done by Xie Yu at Beida, the Chinese Family Panel Survey that many of you in this room have used. And what this shows you, for those of you who aren't sociologists, here we have sex and birth year. So these are the people born in 1940. And this is the men and women who cohabited before marriage. And you can say it's quite low, quite stable. In this period, it stays below 5%. And then as time goes on and certainly more chaotic conditions in some ways, you see more cohabitation. But the other piece that's happening is a rural story in which there's official control over age of marriage, but in the rural setting, marriage as it's facilitated by parents and the local community occurs prior to the official registration. So what we're seeing here is primarily that story. Then as you go further up here, we're seeing something very different. And this is the normalization in the big cities now that cohabitation, either as a step towards marriage or as a trial marriage, or even as part of dating culture, is now accepted. 25%, some people would say 30%. And this is a very marked departure from the past. And it tells us the way in which sexual intimacy occurs outside of marriage or prior to marriage. Now, this is by a very famous Chinese sociologist, Pan Suiming, and this is using, this comes from his book. It was published last summer, and the reason I'm using it is because it was published last summer, even though it's only goes through 2015. For those of you who don't read Chinese, what this says is what basically, have you been unfaithful to your partner? Have you, jumped the road, gone off the track? Okay, and so these are men who have gone off the track. These are women who have gone off the track. And this is when a couple both have, quote, gone off the track. These numbers, many people would say underestimate. I'm not gonna, I don't have another way of judging it, but I do think it captures the reality that for men in China, this is 2015, a very high percentage, 1/3, it's higher than what's reported, for example, in the United States, have had an extramarital or a relationship outside of a partnership. And the next slide is how do you respond? And here, what I wanted to introduce, we'll pick it up later, it's the age group. So these are people, right, born before 1960, born after 1970, 80, 90. This is the youngest group. This group is less likely to be married. So when they're answering this question, I think it may be more dating. How do you feel if your partner cheats? But this group here is the married group, very likely. And so how do you feel if your partner cheats? I don't want to know. Right? I don't want to know. The older people, I don't want to know. Among the younger ones, they are unlikely to say that. Instead, this is the one they choose, more likely. And it's, we're going to break up or divorce. So here, this group is, as I've said, a divorce revolution. It's this ratio of marriages to divorces at 2 to 1 at some point, 2.4 to 1 last year. Even among the older group, marriage, divorce, splitting up or divorce is real. And then this is, you want to solve it. You're going to talk it through. That still is a possibility. And this group is going to talk, this younger group is going to talk it through, these two. Get the Xiao San, attack her or them. This is, it's quite interesting. I mean, these are, it's a survey. So we have this older group, I'm going to get her. On the younger one, I'm going to get her. And then this one, the youngest group, they really have it out for Xiao San. It's a survey. I'm not saying, I'm putting it out here because it does capture the change over time. And also this piece is very robustly confirmed by many different sources that if someone cheats, male or female cheats, or you've lost the trust, you will divorce. And for those of you who don't focus on Chinese law or Chinese divorce, in China, most divorces are consensual. You go to the registration and the two couples, they say to the registrar, we no longer have affection for each other. Here is our ID card. We've made the arrangements for our property. We've made the arrangements for our children, if they're children, and you're granted the divorce. It's very cheap. There's no lawyer. It's not done in a court. The court cases, which is about 20%, are only the most difficult ones. And the rule since at least 2015 is the court will deny you the divorce the first time. It's like, come back again in 6 months. Now it's come back again the second time. So it's really difficult to get a divorce in court, which then pushes more and more people to say, okay, we're going to cut my losses and go to the registry. There is a new cooling off period, which they've copied Hong Kong. It's for 30 days. It seems to have had no impact. Because if you reach the point you're going to divorce, and it's this kind of registry divorce, if you have to wait 30 days before you get the final paper, it's not going to make too much difference. Where it does make a difference is with domestic violence. And those are the people who oppose the cooling off period, because a woman, it's almost always the woman who's in an abusive relationship, and this is in the court cases, finally she's been granted a divorce, but then there's another 30 days. And so it's in this period that she's even more vulnerable than she was before. So this is where people who specialize in domestic divorce in China are now having debates. Okay. Now, main theme, future of marriage. Under these 4 demographic, I'm going to cite 4 conditions to come to the conclusion. So the first demographic condition of sub-replacement TFR among women of all educational backgrounds. And I stress that because in other countries, falling birth rates and low TFR is primarily driven by women's having more education and women staying in the labor force over their childbearing years. In the case of China, because it was the one-child policy that cut across and required all women, urban women, of their job or of their education to have only one child. China is an extreme situation in which this sub-replacement TFR is rather uniform by the education of mothers. Second one is this internal migration that has now meant that the majority of unmarried men and women live apart from their parents. And they live apart from their parents for months at a time, even years at a time. And again, this attenuates the ability of parents to control or even dictate their children's choice of partner. The no-fault divorce has now become a norm. And as I said, most divorces are outside the courts. So again, this is another piece of the future, the present and the future. And the last, which I've used in the cohabitation slide, is currently in China, marriage no longer is conflated with sexual intimacy. And by that I mean that premarital sexuality is now normative. Whether one is rural or whether one is urban, dating couples are, majority will be sexually intimate, and this is not stigmatized. This is part of the dating culture. Migrants would be the most free in a certain way because they are free from their home village and they're living apart from their families. They're living in really tough circumstances, and their intimate life is definitely it grows outside of the marital relationship. It's one of the reasons why these marriages are also fragile. They're fragile for lots of reasons, but one of the experiences of being a migrant and migrating again and again, which is the norm for young people in China now, is that it creates extraordinary instability in your life and makes you eager to connect to people, but then also unable to maintain that connection. So what happens next? Are we going to see these kinds of happy couples that the government would like? I don't think this is the trend. Here are the numbers through last year. You can see that this is by quarter. Some times of year are better for marriages than others. But regardless, we can see the downward trend. And I don't expect this to pick up in large part right now because the economic conditions in China are difficult. And this makes it very, very hard, particularly for young men, to imagine that they can commit to a marriage, which requires investment on housing, investment in the wedding, and this is not really possible. So there's a waiting situation. And why I say that is it's possible that it will tick up. It's possible that what we're seeing in China now is a delay, and it's a delay driven by economic difficulty. But this is another piece which we'll pick up, I'm sure, in the Q&A, and this gets to the difference between men and women. In this last slide, we're talking marriages. So, and most of these are heterosexual unions, so we're talking about a man and a woman, and that's what you're seeing here. But this is a survey that was, which I found last summer, and this is part of a growing gap between men and women, that it seems from many sources, this one is one of the easiest to summarize, men are more interested in marriage than women. And this is, and we would say that because men get more from marriage. Men don't have to give up as much. Traditional rules of the game for marriage puts men in a stronger position. Your employer doesn't punish you. In fact, your employer rewards you because a man who marries has shown himself to be an adult and someone who's willing to take responsibility. A woman who's going to be married is likely to get pregnant, and that is not something that employers want. So women entering marriage, it's going to be more costly in certain ways for their jobs. We also going to, what happens when you marry? Under these new rules where conjugal property is no longer protected as it was, if you enter a marriage, and if your name is not on the deed, which it rarely is, you are more vulnerable. Even if it's a happy union and consider it your home, it's very unlikely that a woman would pressure, some do, to have her name on the deed. So that coming into a marriage, women are on a different trajectory, and the consequences of being married are gender distinct. And I stress this because in the socialist period, the high socialist period for urban, what we saw was a diminution of this gendered distinction. They were married, men and women married at a closer age. It went from like a 4-year difference to a 2-year difference. Housing, as I said, supplicant to estate. Housing came from your unit, and it was a rental. It wasn't in your husband. I mean, it may have come more likely from your husband's unit if he was more senior, but still, it wasn't his apartment. And this also created greater, I would say, equality. And then the wage structure was such that men and women's wages were not as distinct. All those things have changed, so that we see more gap, female-male gap in wages. Of course, women have to retire 10 years before men. They are less likely to have leadership, and the housing is more likely, the conjugal home, to be owned by his parents or given by his parents to the son. So and that's where I'm going at the end of this, men and women are coming at this moment to decide on marriage with different expectations and with different pressures. What we saw on this table, which is a survey that was done last spring, is you ask them, do you think you can commit to one romantic partner in a lifelong relationship? Yes, 44% of men, only 30% of women. And when we look at no, 3.4% of men say no, 6.7% of women in this survey say, no, I can't do it. And then it depends. Again, it's the women are more doubtful than the men. And this doesn't mean that that will be their behavior, but it means their expectation. That women, as they go into this, are afraid that this is not a lifetime commitment. Men are more willing, at least, to say that's what they want. So this is just one simple little clue of that. The gender difference is important and growing. Okay, now, almost finished. As this you've seen, is it likely that this fertility rate is going to rise? Is the government going to succeed in getting third births? If we look at all the other parts of East Asia, it doesn't seem likely. And for all of us who spend time in China or from China know that the decision to have a child, a second child, not to mention a third child, is not driven by the government's either incentives or their pressure that you become pregnant and carry a child to term. This comes from usually a couple making a decision, and particularly a woman making a decision. And from everything that's happening right now in China, it seems very unlikely that the government's enthusiasm for a third birth is going to change this. Now, this is the closing part. What about the parents? Several times I've mentioned how parents lost control of their children's marriages, and currently for the majority of young people who are migrating, how their parents are far away. Their parents have relatively few resources to give them. Does that mean the parents play no role? What I've observed, and this we are just seeing the edge of it, is I see a shift now with parents becoming generally less anxious, less demanding that a child marry, less willing to say that an unmarried child is an abnormal child. If a person has a sibling, then they really have much less family pressure. But for the urban one child, this is not the option. They don't have a sibling to marry so they can be single. But what we're looking at is then these urban parents. And marriage is the union of the family. The matchmaking is the parental strategy. And the primary loyalty axis of parents in these new marriages is often that vertical one. And that vertical one for the one-child policy is particularly strong for urban women. And this really sets this generation apart from earlier generations. And it puts these single children in a structurally unstable position. That is, your parents, as a singleton, have been the focus of your parents' attention, your parents' investment. It's the core for both generations. But at marriage, you're making a voluntary choice to make a horizontal link. And this is a more difficult one to make. And it can succeed, and it's not that the institution is going to dissolve, but it is structurally a very tough place for young people, especially only children in urban China now. So the parents. This is from the interviews and the observations I did in Shanghai in 2015. The paper we wrote is called Reinstating the Family, and it uses a survey, a wonderful survey, a random sample of 1,300 people born between 1980 and 1989 living in Shanghai, 40% of whom are migrants. So that's what I did with some of this material. And one of the things that was interesting about this group of parents is a very high percentage of them are not Shanghainese. These are, yes, very often they are whitey parents who have come to take care of their child who has emigrated, or to invest and guide their child to a marriage. And this is the marriage-making corner that's gotten so much attention. Last week in Beijing, I went to the marriage corner in Yuyuan Han Park. And it's every Saturday from 2 to 5. This picture, you can't identify anyone, but I did take this picture. And we were there for 2 hours walking around and talking to the parents. The advertisements, as they were, are very similar to the ones that I saw in Shanghai, and where we did actually structured interviews. These are, if you don't read Chinese, so everyone's got they've got numbers, so that there's a book where you can find the number of the person. It tells you what year they were, whether it's a male or a female. These are all women, which is the general pattern. There are some men, but it's generally parents looking for spouses for their daughter. It tells you the year she's born, how tall she is, what kind of degree she has, what kind of hukou she has, what kind of profession she has, and then it goes on, and then it gives the context. At the bottom, doesn't give the telephone numbers. In some cases, they will actually have the telephone number. Parents, however, are basically looking at other parents. They are not expecting to find a son-in-law. And so it's searching for matching doors. But the thing that was striking to me, and I'm almost at the end, as I said, in Shanghai, what was so striking was a very high percentage of the parents looking for spouses in these matchmaking corners are from outside of Shanghai. And it's a social event for them. They're there to meet other parents. They commiserate with other parents. They don't expect to find a match, but they do find friends. And it becomes a very important moment of socializing. So last week in Beijing, I went with one of my TFs, she's from North China, where she's lived in South China. She speaks about 5 different dialects, and she has a very good ear. And we walked around for 2 hours, and her task was to see how many, what was the accent? Are we dealing here with a Beijing group of families, or is it going to be like Shanghai? And these were Beijing families. This is just a clue. This gives you a sense. I think Xiling said, yes, I do surveys. Yes, I use big data sets and other people's data sets, and I use census data. But always I come back to the ground, and I try to listen. I try to think and try to put these things together. So this was an important takeaway from last week, that in this Beijing side, these parents were coming to socialize, but they were coming to socialize with other Beijing families. And it wasn't a place, at least this one, where YV people were coming. We could say, of course, Beijing has gone through a demographic change these last 5 years in which there are fewer and fewer, right, non-Beijing people. So that's also what we were capturing. So the wedding, this is not a picture I took, but it comes from the wedding industry. I did lots of interviews of wedding organizers. I went to weddings, I watched videos, etc. And this looked like a lot of the weddings that I went to. Highly choreographed events. The article I wrote for this was called Performing Happiness for Self and Others. So that the wedding was absolutely critical for parents. Parents were not critical to find a spouse. Only a minority of people were relying on their parents to help them find a match. But the wedding, across social class, was a moment that the parents were celebrated, and the parents were showing their network that they were successful parents. Many, many young people that I interviewed and read about would have preferred the destination wedding, would have preferred just go to the registry and move on with one's life. But this would be hurtful to the parents. So again and again, the message that I was told, as well as when I interviewed the organizers, was this is the parental event. And that still is true. So while I'm saying that the marriage institution is weaker, there are many stresses and strains on this horizontal, vertical, and non-vertical, the horizontal voluntary link. The economic situation makes it difficult. Migration makes it difficult. The institution and the rituals and the celebrations that go with it are robust. And the parents are deeply invested in that. And yet I also sense from the conversations that I've had in the last 2 years that more and more parents are willing to give their child the choice, and that the parents are not as invested in their child finding a marriage partner in order to be normal. And so I think there is a shift among this rising generation of parents who, not surprisingly, themselves, have a different experience than their parents or even those who are 15 years their elder. And so there is a lot of change. So what is the future? I think it will remain an institutional gateway to parenthood. I don't think China is going to move away from keeping childbearing within the marital relationship. I think it will look like Japan and Korea and Hong Kong and Taiwan and Singapore. And so it is the gateway to being a parent. The government is going to continue to be focused on it. The pictures I showed at the beginning, the documents that are being announced, that is in place. So we keep looking at it. But it is a fragile institution. The necessity and desirability is going to vary by gender, but also by generation. So if I wrap it up, what I want to say is that if we think about where marriage as an institution is going, there's going to be his marriage version, or her marriage version, and of their marriage. By that, I'm referring to the parents. So it's not going to be one single coherent experience. There's going to be variation within it. And as a social scientist, I, of course, am fascinated to see, how it does evolve. It's there, it's supported by the state, it is robust in many ways, but it is an institution that is evolving. And so that's the final answer to what is the future of marriage in China. Of course.
For the discussion on the topic. For our on-site audience, please raise your hand if you have a question, and we will pass you the microphone. For online audience, please type your question in the chat of the webinar.
Is this
and
the
our
one?
moderator will
I
ask
think.
the question on behalf of you. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming our moderator, Professor Felix Chang, to the stage. And over to you,
Thanks.
Professor Felix.
Thank you. Hello. Hello. Thank you so much, Professor Davis. That was a very concise and I think very comprehensive presentation, particularly I think of the easing of state regulation of marriage as an institution, which is a very important factor, I think, for a lot of the phenomena that you presented, including the rising rate of infidelity, the rising divorce rate, the fertility issue, and so on, which in a way brings me, or I think some of us, to the question. So who actually would want to get married, right? Not speaking for myself. Because why marry when there are all these uncertainties, when there are all these responsibilities and so on? So could you speak a little bit
Sure.
before I open the floor?
Right. What I wanted to stress was it's the institution is under stress, and to have a stable and a satisfying marriage is not easy. But it is, when we did the focus group, which were about premarital acts, other kinds of contracts, I think it's an institution where people hope they can find someone they trust. And those who have good matches, those who find a partner, that is what people are seeking. It's in an earlier age, and especially in rural China, and still parts in rural China, it is really an instrumental material exchange for which there is no other option. And that's the gateway to being an adult. It's the gateway to get a home. It's a gate, etc. And now that's no longer the case. There are more choices, and you don't need marriage in order to have a home. You don't need marriage to have a position to be treated as an adult. But the desire for a trusting relationship is perhaps even more important. And I think for younger, I would even say, if you interview and you read people who are under the age of 35, in which personal realization, personal autonomy is so important, so is a desire to find a soulmate. And one of the things that you hear, and I'd be interested in the audience, is a sense that we are fated. A lot of people talk about Yuanfen or Mingyun. This is, I found my soulmate now is used in English, but what they usually talk about is, we are fated, and we are partners. And so this kind of trust, which is absent in so many other parts of life, is something you find in marriage.
Thank you so much. So now, are there any questions? Many. So Professor Andy Caithness.
Oh, well, thank you
Can you please wait for the mic?
This might be the hardest question of the whole afternoon.
Hopefully not that hard. So thank you very much for that wonderful talk. And I was just thinking, perhaps a bit of a stereotype, but I'm not sure. I'm wondering about questions of child custody and alimony in divorce. And how has this evolved? And is this a factor in people's consideration of getting married? And I guess my stereotype would be that in East Asia, the men keep the children and they don't have to pay alimony. But in the West, the men lose the children and they have to pay alimony. But how is this negotiated and how has it changed and how does it affect how people think about it?
Okay, for the audience online, as well as the rest of them, so Professor Kipnis is one of the world's experts on these topics, and has a deep, deep knowledge, especially, I think, your years in Shandong, you really have it deep. Legally, as you know, if a child is under 2, it's the mother, right? So, and a nursing child will stay with the mother no matter what, that's the law. When there were more than 2, the norm would be the mother would take the girl and the son, and the father would take the son. In terms of alimony, it's written through a child support. It's not support to the wife, and that's the legal piece. That's what the law says. And I found, at least reading about divorces, that generally that was the way it was done. In the newer, now we are starting to get more data. What percentage of divorcing couples have children? And the percentage is going up. So you have now this more, the distribution is polarized. So at one end, you have these very young couples divorcing usually within 4 years of marriage who have no children. So the no children, no alimony, they're splitting, they're moving up, and they're getting on with it, with the exception being these disputes over housing, which is what I spent all those years looking at. And the one-child policy part now, if we're in the urban, half of these are only girls. These women, they have their parents home. So at the splitting, it's not that they're going to be homeless. So that this marital housing issue also is rather finessed, but alimony is not part of it. When we look at older couples, they tend to be later they generally, if it's teenage children, the divorce usually will be delayed unless it's an absolutely impossible situation. And then at that point, children can decide. I think, is it 16 that they decide? Yeah, so that's what you can do. So if the court at earlier point, the boy went with the father and the girl went with the mother, or whatever was the way in which they did it, at 16, children can then decide. And so that is another pattern that you'd see. But it's definitely not the stereotype. Children go with mothers and husbands pay alimony, and that's not the situation in China.
Thank you. Professor Suzanne Choi?
The next expert in the room. Professor Choi is including men.
Really, thank you very much for this wonderful talk. I'm not sure if my question, I think it's not really related to what you have said. I think it's appropriate because even the title is called Future Marriage. I want to ask you maybe even a speculation about what is the possibility for the Chinese government to legalize same-sex marriage?
Right. The question is about same-sex marriage. I would say 5 years ago, many people thought China was on a trajectory that would look like Taiwan in that respect. And in the last 3 years, there have been, as we know, real steps backward. Another piece of this lecture, which there wasn't time for, is the increased possibility for same-sex intimacy, which was definitely being destigmatized, and multiple ways in which it was supported. But right now, with the current administration, I would say there's no sign at all that they're moving in that direction. The advantage is custodial. That is, if a same-sex couple is a household, and which is not against the law, but they're not legally married, but can they have custody or guardianship should one partner die or lose the ability to support them? Yes. So the gain has been for children. And I think also with surrogacy, that's where I see trends that are more in line with what we see in the rest of the world. It is to protect the child. It is not about the two consenting adults as much. What do you think? Okay, she's the expert. What do you think? What do you think?
I think my observations are in line with your observations, and I think what my major concern is about the civil society. Because when I think about same-sex marriages, globally, of course, that is the government that is making the decision. But a lot of the time, the countries that are legalizing same-sex marriage because of civil society campaigns and advocacy. And I think what we are observing now is that China is allowing that have, for example, really big dating apps, gay dating apps. So it's more about, this digital space that are commodified, but it's not really, I think it's squeezing the civil society. So I think the voices, to campaign or, for same-sex marriage, I think is really declining. So I think maybe this is another factor that will increase the possibility that maybe in the next 10 years that that this will happen. But I agree with you that I think maybe China the government can be quite selective. Maybe they will open up more avenues for same-sex couples to have access to good reproductive technology and also maybe adoption. But we don't know. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Professor Maria Tan?
Thank you for wonderfully informative talk. I was just thinking about two things while I was listening to the presentation. First thing has to do with the past, probably because the whole system. I didn't see you mention it, very much. But I was looking at the Beijing marriage corner advertising. So one of the requirements is still, they want Beijing hukou. So are we talking about the immense trends of migration haven't really taken have gone deep enough into this thing about young people creating futures through marriage. So, and perhaps parents' role in it as well. So maybe it's something about the administrative system plus how people understand marriage itself in relation to the patriarchal kinds of values. And so in relation to that, I have a question for the future. And which is, you mentioned at the end of the lecture that it would be difficult for the Chinese government to do really anything about raising the
Fertility rate.
yes.
Yeah.
So and that women are very doubtful, more doubtful than the men about marriage. So would it not be that the Chinese government is viewing the dilemma? Because if they don't want to give up the patriarchal values that underlie a lot of this administrative or systemic kinds of arrangements, is it possible at all to get the women to be willing to get into marital relations? Because if you see all these consequences that are negative within the marriage, would be on women's side. So, for example, filial piety really has a more male face to it. And so how do we look at these and whether you think these are important?
There's so many things. I can't, first of all, I don't have answers. But I just want to say something about the hukou piece, since you did see it there. I want to stress that these are older Beijing parents who are showing up there. So it's what we're seeing is these older Beijing parents are most concerned that there be a match. And we found that earlier. In other words, if you're a parent and if you think you're going to look for a spouse for your unmarried child, you want them to come with a family that was also going to have Beijing hukou. You do not want to get involved with families that are outside. Right, and so this matching on hukou is very important for some people, right? And so that's what that is capturing, I think, reflecting. Your last thing, about filial piety, I would say, and many of the people in this room are experts on this, what we've seen in the last 15 years, survey after survey, I think Jane will be the one to comment on this, is that daughters are more likely actually to give help to their parents than sons. Daughters are the ones who provide the majority of care for parents. And so parents, especially the parents of an only daughter, have instilled in her that kind of filiality, and the power of loyalty between parents and children, I think, is extremely strong. And I don't think it is any more necessarily, quote, patrilineal, patriarchal. I think it's bilateral. And we just find this in survey after survey, as well as patterns, that can be documented. So this other question, the third one you have, whether the administrative state seems to be speaking in the language of patriarchy. And of course, we see virtually no women in leadership positions at the top. And we look at these leaders' performance and the things, well, for example, whether it's the one-child policy or thinking now they can legislate marriage or legislate fertility, this is coming from, a group of men who seem to be clueless about what's actually happening in their society. But at the level of the society, I think families are very strong. I think the filial tie is very strong, and I don't think it's primarily patriarchal and patrilineal.
Thank you. Student White, yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for your lectures in which you talk about how people's ideas and practice about sexual intimacy and marriage have changed in the past decades. And of course, Thursdays plays a very important role in shaping people's ideas and practice. Based on my observation, I think private sectors also play a very important role in shaping people's such ideas and practice, especially those advertising brands and companies. They would tell people that you can embrace new type of intimacies by buying the products provided by our companies, such as virtual lovers, which is becoming increasingly popular in China.
Mm-hmm.
So I would wonder, how would you consider the role of private sectors in shaping the future of marriage in China?
Sure. So the arc of this talk was, here's what the state wants. The state is not going to get what it wants. That's the whole lecture today. They want this, but they're not going to get it. And of course, flagged it up. There's been an economic revolution, and of course, most people are working in the private sector. Most of the key economic drivers, even if state-owned enterprise is now, dominant, and it's not that it isn't important, but if we talk about everyday life, of course, the market is hugely important, and self-employment, et cetera, et cetera. So what drives it? And if we talk about why I think there's so few marriages last year and what seems to be this year rather few, even though it's probably a good year to get married, is people can't afford it. So we could say it's the economy, stupid. That's the phrase in American politics, right? And I think that's true for understanding marriage, because this is a point at which two people or people and their families are saying, we're making a commitment to the future to build this future household. And when the economy is so turbulent and people are so uncertain, people are afraid to make that kind of investment. They may have a very engaged and intimate life. That friendship is very important, building those ties of trust. But making a step to formalize it in America times.
Professor something?
Thank you, Professor Davis. I enjoyed a lot from your very rich data sharing. I want to ask about sexuality. I noted that you mentioned that women become more doubtful, they're more uncertain about being loyal, being filial, being committed to a relationship, lifelong relationship. It is the same as what we find in our survey in Greater Bay Area, that when we ask people about the relationship between cohabitation and marriage, in opposite to our imagination based on the double standard of sexuality, that women would say, I'm not so sure about whether the cohabitation will lead to marriage, but men would more likely to say, of course, cohabitation will
Yeah.
lead to marriage. So I'm wondering whether this being more doubtful, and also in social media these days, we can see a lot of fear of marriage, fear of childbearing among young women, 小红书,
Right.
Douban, and
Okay.
on Hupu, which is a male-dominated platform. The tone is totally different. So I'm wondering what will be the implication of this gender divide in popular
Right.
attitudes? Because if women turn out to be more suspicious, more doubtful, more uncertain about the future of marriage, then will that lead to a phenomenon that women become the target of state regulation? And if that will be the case, what can be done? Because someone who remains more silent will not be the target of state regulation. Or state regulation and market dynamics have been targeting at women as the major source of consumerism or the major target of and also this rise of tendencies in misogyny. When people talk about it is because of women who do not want to enter the marriage, and we talk about to stay safe and healthy, you need to stay away from marriage. People worry about you. So I'm wondering. So when people are talking about this kind of discord, there will be a tendency in misogyny, and there will be some kind of unfavorable regulations going on. So I want to ask about that.
I think your first point, I don't know if they heard that the survey about cohabitation, so that men are more likely to believe that cohabitation will lead to marriage than women. And that's a really important correlation and probably has a causal thing to it. But what I would stress as, we're both sociologists, is that I want to, gender is one piece, but then I have to look at it in the other ways. Because I think that what I found a long time ago when I was doing work here in Hong Kong on housing and housing values, that the variation by social class is quite large. And I think this is going to be true, the theme that you've raised, and we need more information. But I find that, for example, this is the case in the United States, that when men and women have comparable education and comparable class, we find their values on these issues of marriage and sexuality actually are quite close. And so if we want to explore this, I think we want to unpack the social class variation. And so it's gender and generation, but then also this, whether it's going to be education or income, and then probe and see what's happening. Whether the weaker partner is going to be more vulnerable to state manipulation is a whole nother discussion, which I don't think we don't have time for today, but we can continue later.
Thank you. Yes. Teaching someone.
Thank you so much, Professor Davis. It's a real treat to listen to your talk. I really enjoy hearing about your insights about the migrant population. Now that there's been so much discussion about the migrants themselves, there's already been discussion about the left behind children, as well as the children who have come along to the cities with their parents who were born in the cities, two parents who live there, but their hukou is somewhere else. I wonder if you have any insights or any maybe hints in your mind of what is to come for trends relating to marriage in these second generation migrants. There are two very different populations, the left behind and in the cities, but nevertheless, there's probably some interesting trends that maybe you're already starting to see. Thanks.
Can't talk about the trends, but in the project I did on weddings, where I had interviewed the 100 couples, 10 were migrants. And they were the second generation, as you said. So they had come mainly from Anhui as teenagers or they had been sent back and then they came. So they started in their parents' construction company or their stall, their food stall. And then as in most parts of China, but especially these big cities, those kids can't go to Gaokao usually. Can't go to Gaozhong, but they can go to the vocational school. So this is where you'll see the quote second generation migrant children. And it was the ones, I mean, I just have the interviewees, so I don't have a big sample. What struck me was that these are self-starters. These are people who have very flexible, but they're also, the marriage part is very important to them because it's part of making a family in this new place. And so I think the migrant story is actually the modal story right now in China. That is, most unmarried adults are migrants. So just like most children in school right now are not living with both parents, you know, this is China today. And so I think this is to be a focus. I mean, if we want to, it's 1.4 billion people. We're not going to generalize the Chinese, right? But I think this migrant group is one that needs to be given particular attention. As you said, were they left behind and then did they move? Did they move with their parents? Or as often is the case, they moved back and forth. This migrant generation of young adults have made many moves. And one of the strengths that comes from that is this self-sufficiency. It's like, if there's a problem, they're going to solve it. I would say that's kind of what I pick up from this literally 200 million young adults. And that's the future of China, as much as the people in the cities, who are also the future of China.
Thank you. We have time for one or two short questions. Yes, the gentleman there, please. And we have the mic over there.
About the data, so I'm very interested in the data that you share about how do young people or different generations of people deal with their partners cheating, and maybe they people's and there are some facts about outside marriage and something like that. So my question is how do sociologists gather this data regarding this very thing?
Okay, so as I said, this is from Tan Sui-Ming's survey. This is not my data, right? And he did through the 2015, so when he published it in 2017, this is 7 years ago. The reason I used it in this lecture, and I used it in my teaching this fall, was that it appeared in the summer when I was preparing my course and when I knew I was going to give this lecture, and we settled on the title, and there it was, you know, and I thought about it. I didn't necessarily at that time know I was going to use it, but for today's lecture, I thought it was an interesting graphic because I think he's a very excellent researcher. When he reports these frequencies, I think they are capturing something that really is the trend over time, and that more men, when asked in these surveys, admit to being unfaithful. That's what we have here. We don't know the actual incidents, but we do know what he captured. And I used it because it aligns with what else I am observing in China. I don't have another survey, and I myself have never done this kind of survey. Our survey in Shanghai was asking people, there were several questions, but we were asking people, how did you meet your mate if they're married? And then they had various options. And then we had all this other information about them. So in my analysis of that data, what you saw there, the takeaway then was men, what was it that was distinguishing of men who relied on their parents? Controlling for all else, it was they had a father who had a political position. For women, controlling for all else, they had a Shanghai Hukou. So my own surveys indicated that when people turn to their parents for help, men who haven't found a partner themselves are more likely to be relying on their parents if their fathers have some asset, in this case, a political position. For women, it goes back to this Hukou piece, that it seems that women and their families, at least in Shanghai, are particularly concerned that the Hukou match, rather like this Beijing, that the parents, they don't want a YD in-law. They want the in-law, especially if it's their daughter. They want the boy to be local, and they don't want the boy to be non-local. So that, in terms of my survey, that's where I actually crunched the numbers and, worked in this analytic way. That table that you saw is somebody else's table, but it aligns with what I perceive and am capturing in many different ways about a greater willingness of men to talk about infidelity. That's what it has. Are women less? They're just not reporting it. And I do think, however, it's probably likely that men have more affairs than women. Although when we look at, there's another piece of that, the longer people are married, then the rate of infidelity of men and women becomes more similar. That's another takeaway.
We have time for one very short question. That gentleman over there, yes.
Thank you for your approach. My question is that, how about the situation compared with Europe and or USA?
I didn't hear what the question is, comparing it?
The situation compared with Europe and
Right.
or USA.
Okay, so marriage rates are rather low. They've been very low for about 25 years. Majority of children are born outside of a marital relationship. However, and this is true increasingly in the US, although there's a very different class ratio. So the US does not look exactly like Europe, except that in both these areas, including in places like Mexico and Latin America and the Caribbean, you have a pattern in which family formation as a mother and a child occurs outside of marriage. And in the Western Hemisphere, particularly in the Caribbean area, which these are built on slave states in the Caribbean in particular, you have a tradition of family formation in which the owners of the plantation, undercut the ability, but people formed families. And in the Chinese case, for all the reasons we know, this is enforced in multiple ways so that children are born to married couples. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Davis.
Thank you.
Thank you.